Peace and love, everyone. I'm here with Davidya Buckland, following up on our last chat that we had on the levels of enlightenment. David is the author of Our Natural Potential and someone that I consider an expert in the field of the phases of enlightenment and the progressive unfoldment of the reality of our pure divinity. So we're here today to chat a little bit more about that and go into some subjects that we didn't exactly get the chance to touch on last time. So I just want to thank you, David, for taking the time to talk with me again.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
So I had a few things that I wanted to go over just to begin with, and that's when we talk about levels of enlightenment, we talk about stages in this process of realization. Sometimes in certain circles, it can be seen as something that's non-existent, that there are no stages, there are no shifts, there's nothing going on. In certain cases, that's the way that it's approached. And when we zoom out and actually look at what's being described both in your work and the work that's being put forth here and in many others, that can actually be noted as a particular stage where, if there isn't the knowledge that there is a progressive unfoldment or there are different qualitative shifts in our recognition of reality, that stage can be mistaken to be absolute. And it's something that's very easily and naturally fallen into. It's not a position that's being taken necessarily, but something that just seems to be the case irrespective of whatever else is being said. So I think it's important to acknowledge the fact that every level or every recognition of reality does seem to be absolute in its nature, because it is a subjective presentation of the absolute.
I agree, yes. And there are things, for example, like the Brahman shift, when you experience going beyond consciousness, can sound ridiculous to someone in an advanced unity stage where they are all of consciousness. And consciousness is infinite, it's eternal, it's absolute. It's a ridiculous idea that there will be something beyond that. And it can certainly be, you can certainly see how some of the old texts that describe advanced stages can be interpreted in the context of and applied to an initial awakening, self-realization. I've also seen, for example, some of the people in the Papaji lineage, they don't talk about stages because they feel it'll create concepts. From what I understand, they recognize there's stages, but they don't talk about them to avoid people getting caught in some, more mind stuff. And they assume essentially the availability of a teacher to support the person through the process when it actually shows up. And then you have, it's kind of like a scale. Like on one end, people don't talk about it. And then there's people like Adyashanti who talk about head, heart, gut, for example. They talk about a process, or more recently, he's been talking about no self, unity, and no self again as a way of talking about Brahman, because then have terminology like that in there. And so he's talking about stages, but he frames it in a kind of broader, more general way. He goes into specifics of experience in some cases. And then there's kind of like people like me who go into all these little details and the variations and kind of like trying to establish some models and parameters to cover the broader territory and how it shows up in a number of different people.
Sure, it's just a point of reference, and I can just speak from what unfolded here that it was extremely helpful and conducive to continued development, to know that just because there is this recognition that I am the infinite reality, that's not the end of the road.
Yeah.
That from a certain perspective, that's just the beginning. That us recognizing our reality to be infinite is just the beginning.
Yes, and if you get a strong concept in there that says this is the ultimate, this is the absolute, then there can be resistance to anything more unfolding. So there can be openings, but then a sense of closing that off, because it can feel, a few people I've talked to, for example, have felt like they were losing their enlightenment.
Mm.
But actually what was happening was they were opening up to another stage, but they didn't understand that because that wasn't part of their picture. Or they had dismissed my comments. In one case, somebody who argued against me for a couple of years, and then came back around again and said, "I apologize. You're right. There's more."
Sure, beautiful. Yeah, that's sort of what I was referring to in the when I began speaking, in that in a space that's more masculine in its nature, referring to the masculinity of divinity, there's a heavier emphasis on negation, on a sort of detached, silent changelessness. And so the idea of there being these shifts that are often spoken about with flows of compassion and love and radiance, things like this, seem to be not a possibility from a heavily masculine condition.
Or
And in
they're conceived
particular,
as irrelevant or distracting in some way.
sure, yes, even something that's undesirable. Yeah.
Yeah.
And when I said that nothing's going on, I was sort of uh, not mocking, but there was a little parody on the condition which I call void, or we could call a very deep Brahman phase, where nothingness, supreme nothingness, is the reality.
Yeah.
And I've seen it happen where one can move into that stage very quickly and not really even have a recognition of anything preceding it, and it feeling like that's the primary shift, or that's the only shift.
Yeah, and also I've seen people move through the self-realization unity Brahman process really quickly
Mm-hmm.
and not have that more feminine side and the opening the heart in there. And then there's a process of having to catch up to that, but it can mean that the Brahman shift itself is quite flat, and that it's harder for that to open up. One of my teachers was just recently speaking about that, and how it's important not to rush through unity too fast. You want to get a chance for, because there's those initial shift, like waking up, for example, is just happens in a snap, in a split second. But all those layers of expression we have from consciousness up to the surface, they're each progressively more uh, dense, I guess you could say, more progressively more inertial. And so it takes time for them to catch up to those major shifts. Usually it takes the mind a little bit of time, and a few days or so on, but the body can take quite a bit longer. And there's all the kind of internal adjustments and so on that can take place.
Yes, beautiful. One thing that I've noticed is as well is that with each shift, there's a surfacing of certain material which was not recognized or was unconscious in the recognition of reality preceding the shift.
Yes.
And so a prerequisite on some level, whether it's known or not, is a willingness to face and resolve that material. It doesn't have to be a conscious thing that we make a declaration about, but it's more of just an absolute willingness for the unfoldment to be what it is, and to be with it in a way that is receiving and allowing of whatever is arising.
Yes, although I have noticed, I had this idea that there were certain kinds of um, contractions or resistance that were released with certain stages. And I think in an ideal way that does take place. Like I mentioned earlier, Ida Shanti talking about head, heart, gut. There's kind of like these three types of or styles of the contraction that can go with the first three stages.
Mm.
And but I've since seen a number of people who didn't. Again, they went further more quickly without the feminine side, without the refinement and heart opening, and so that stuff didn't catch up so much, and there has to be some adjustment later.
Beautiful point. Yes, I was speaking more from the model here, where I describe it as either being a masculine condition or a feminine condition. So the condition is either more of a masculine dominance or it's more of a feminine dominance. So unlike in your book where you describe both sides in each phase, or you look at a side as being a phase and then the other side as being the refined value of that phase of development, I just break it down as a contextual modality, which is basically just a condition of conscious awareness where it recognizes itself to be an infinite contextual field.
Yes.
This contextual condition, or these contextual conditions, either are primarily feminine or primarily masculine. So there's a dominance at play. And there's also a balancing out, or a marriage, if you will, taking place in the process. And so if there is this heavy emphasis on the masculine side of things, whether we call it masculine or not, or we even know that that's what it is, or that's a way of contextualizing it, if there is this heavy emphasis on that side of things, there is going to be that leaning towards negation. And a lot of the surfacing and resolution isn't really going to be, there's not going to be the capacity to really be with it.
Right.
Because the idea of being with material that was accumulated through us taking ourselves to be this little tiny person is irrelevant. You know, it's all nonsense anyway.
It's the past.
Yeah, just whatever. Yeah. And so I've seen that side of things too, what you're talking about, where it just moves very quickly in that masculine way, and there isn't the cultivation of the fullness and the
right. And the problem that can create then is you've got this old stuff from the person still there, and then the person then starts teaching or having a more powerful influence because of the depth of their that they're operating from, but then the shadows are coming up and they're not seeing them because they think that's all gone and done with, and that's where you get trouble.
Yes, a very, very nice point. And also what can take place is that the teaching can reflect this tendency to try to negate or just brush off stuff.
Yeah.
And so you're actually teaching that to those that are earnestly seeking truth. And a lot of times in the spiritual marketplace, there are those that are actually in a mode of escapism. They're trying to somehow overcome something. And so there's this very subtle transaction that's taking place, sometimes in these more masculine conditions, where they're teaching, so-called teaching, this this sort of just nothing's going on. There's nobody, nowhere, over and over and over again, this kind of thing, if you want to call that teaching. And then and then there are those that sort of are drawn to that by virtue of their own material that there's a tendency to try to get away from.
Yeah.
And so there's actually a very dangerous dynamic taking place there. Not dangerous in a dramatic way, but dangerous in the sense that it's not in the highest evolutionary order.
Yes, I agree, and it can lead to issues, because when that we talked about earlier, but also if you want to have full enlightenment, you've got to deal with that stuff, because it's going to be a shadow on that aspect that can support the higher stages. I mean, you can't really go beyond basic Brahman unless you've got some of that other stuff developed. The whole thing of pure divinity and para-Brahman, those kind of things that I touch on in the book, require that to be present. Otherwise, there just isn't the capacity to even be aware that it's there.
That's exactly right. I oftentimes liken this unto a dimmer switch being turned up in reference to as the light becomes brighter, as the light of pure divinity, the radiance, the brilliance of pure divinity starts to really shine forth, that it shines deeper into the darkness of that unconscious material and actually allows for this stuff that perhaps we couldn't see at an earlier phase of development to be seen in its fullness.
Yeah.
And it correlates with the capacity, I feel that it correlates with the capacity to intelligently resolve it. There's a multiplicity of factors that go into that, willingness being one, intention being another. And as there is that flow of just total offering in divinity to itself, and that flow of just pure surrender and devotion to itself, then with that there is a receiving of all of this material that needs healing, that needs attention, in a way which is in alignment with the recognition of our reality. So at a certain level of power, at a certain level of brightness, there is the capacity to see this, to see it in a way that isn't going to trigger some sort of a shutdown system or whatever the case may be, and to really give it the attention that it needs from the space of our reality being recognized to be what it is.
Right, and to learn some skills too, because so much of our culture is about repression and dismissive and of some of this kind of content. So it's really important to learn new ways of being with it and techniques for it. Because there's a big difference, for example, with innocently experiencing the baggage we have, and because a lot of it is about completing the experience. Essentially, we've had some trauma or difficult experience in some way, and the experience has been partially had, but it hasn't been quite completed. So there's kind of these residues of old experiences. So all we have to do is be able to sit with it and allow the experience, and then it kind of washes over us and completes. Of course, some stuff is a little more complex than that, but it's a very different experience than trying to repress it. Yeah, one of the analogies that, stepping back there slightly too, that comes to mind, it's a little bit, zooming through on the masculine side, it's a little bit like you can get to know consciousness, but in a way that's like empty, dark, flat, and it's like, you move into a new house, a beautiful new house, but there's no lights. And so you got to kind of go around and feel, and then you figure out kind of where the steps are and where the kitchen is, and you can use the house, but with that clearing, the shadow which covers the light, basically, you start to be able to actually see something and discover that there's a light switch, and and you can actually move through the house without kind of having to behave like a blind person. It's a huge difference, because that light of consciousness, it comes from divinity. So it's key to really get to know, and then you can see all the detail and the beauty, and there's so much more. It fills it out so much more with that side of the equation. On the other hand, if there's too much of that, you get lots of fancy subtle experiences and all the light beings and all this kind of stuff, without the grounding in consciousness, without the masculine grounding, then it's kind of like you're tossed around all the time by your experiences. It's hard to just kind of be here in your day-to-day life. So again, it's about balance.
Yes, yeah, it is about that. And I guess in the way that things unfolded here, it was the masculine side of things allowed for that, that radical stability, so that there could be the depth of the truth of the self and beyond could really start to reveal itself, and the recognition of the entirety of the presentation of creation could come to be cognized in a way that wasn't just seeing it as some sort of appearance in a dismissive way, but recognizing the actual intelligence that is underneath the appearance, and the way in which our self is appearing as all of this.
Yes, I witnessed for quite a few years before I finally woke up. And so there was kind of that detachment, being the detached observer to some degree, while there also was still an identified ego in play. So it's kind of like an inner duality. And that did allow a lot of unfolding in terms of perceptions about what you were talking about, which helped moderate the that detachment. But because there was still a lot of stuff in the more surface levels, in the emotions and mind and so on, that had to be cleaned, I ended up sort of becoming aware of the subtle levels of structure of creation and so on before I became aware of the mechanics of how that expressed forward into the world more completely, because that's where I still had all the shadows going on. And so it kind of did it a little bit backwards. So you can kind of get this idea that you kind of work your way more and more subtle and that kind of stuff. And I guess it can happen that way for some people, but it tends more to be, here and there where you're more clear, and then as other things get clear, it kind of fills in, and the gaps are filled and so on.
Yeah. Another thing that I see is that the feminine directly correlates with um, this dynamic expression in the world, so that it's, in a heavily masculine condition, it can be really challenging or difficult to even have a conversation, or to be present at a dinner with your family or whatever, because there's no one there. There's nothing. I mean, you just kind of these talking heads, and uh, there's and you're just, you're the only one there. But it's and so what I've by grace, the flow of this compassion and the understanding of the intelligence that is uh, shining forth from our reality allows for there to be a different level of relation in the context of family dynamics, in the context of just general experiencing in human life.
I agree. And also coming back to the healing aspect, if we're not able to like love and compassion towards who we are, is very profoundly healing. But we do have to come to some value of self-acceptance in that process first uh, before we can get to there. So it's kind of but if we're dismissive of it, then that doesn't help us at all, really. It's just, I mean, if you want to be a monk and live in a mountain somewhere, that's fine. But to be in the world, you need to be in the world. It's really that simple. And so why not enjoy it? Why and this idea that somehow, if we're in this detached place, that's superior in some way. I mean, it is a natural phase. Some people do go through a detached period, and that's fine. But the stage after that, or depending on how it unfolds, but soon after that, you become everything. So it's not that you're detached from anything. You whatever you put your attention on, you recognize that, oh, I am that too, and I'm that, and I'm that. All this is that. It's that's part of the process too. So there can be these extremes, I guess you could say, of reality in that process.
Yes, I suppose that's what I was getting at earlier when I was talking about that, that changeless, just rock-like uh, masculinity of our reality, in a way almost creating some sort of a room or space, so that there can be this fullness that comes um, into that space, which it couldn't have really shown forth unless there was that level of detachment, unless there was that level of sort of moving beyond the surface level dynamics and the very sort of personal in the egoic sense, ways of interpreting and relating experience. So by that sort of being cut asunder, or there being a very natural transcendence of that, with withdrawal, but not in a renunciate way, then that sort of creates a space so that the feminine side of things can come in and fill that with the actual purity and truth of what's taking place there, in the absence of that surface level material.
Yes, I mean, if you look at the dynamics of consciousness itself, I mean, getting kind of abstract here, but fundamentally, consciousness has these kind of three qualities. That's not quite the right word because it's not an express thing, but essentially consciousness is made up of these three values of alertness, liveliness, and intelligence. And the alertness stirs, I mean, rather the liveliness stirs the alertness to become conscious, and then consciousness flows within itself, curves back on itself, and becomes self-aware. So there's this observer quality, the Shiva, the masculine value, that where alertness is dominant, and it has a detached, just alert, it's just aware. And then you have the other quality, other side of it, which is kind of what the object of awareness over here, that has the quality of liveliness more, which is, you know, of becoming, of turning into form and experiences and so on. And then the interaction between them with the intelligence, and it's that. So typically we first become aware of this, the alertness side, the consciousness, inert consciousness by itself there, and then we become more aware of the liveliness aspect, where it's dominant. But then there's that dynamic in between, and of course, you know, when I'm gesturing here with awareness becoming aware of itself, it inherently creates a space. Mm-hmm. by recognizing itself. It creates a subtle form of space into which all these dynamics can unfold. And so that intelligence quality, which is dominantly the divine, has those feminine qualities to it, and it's kind of the most subtle in certain ways. It tends to be the last we become aware of, and yet it's where all the richness and it's like the power of creation and qualities like love and bliss and the flows that give rise to all our experiences. All that comes into play between those two things. I mean, that's kind of a mechanical way to look at it, but those and the quality of time actually comes out of the relationship as well. Space comes out of the self-aware dynamics, and then time comes out of that process. And as we shift through the various our experiences in consciousness, we shift our relationship with the space and with time, so we can experience time and space in a number of different ways. Mm-hmm. Anyways, blah blah blah. But that kind of is the background to what you were talking about, why it works that way.
Sure. Yeah, and it's about a balance, just like you said. And I often refer to this poetic way of looking at it as a sacred marriage that's taking place, and this apparent distinction, or this primary distinction of the masculine and the feminine, and what I consider pure awareness and conscious presence, that are never actually separate. They're never actually two, but there is a distinction that's present. And so there's a reconciliation, I feel, taking place within this process of this distinction, so that it's not an either or situation, so that there's just a oneness of both sides of things.
Right.
And
but there tends to be this process of first we become established in that observer quality, mm-hmm. and then we become more as we recognize that this side is consciousness too. Everything we're looking at around us is also consciousness, mm-hmm. in expression, and then we become aware of the dynamics in between. And so that when we become aware of the dynamics, that's what really brings it all together. Mm. I mean, even in the unity stage, when we recognize that this and this are the same thing, they're both consciousness, it's almost like they disappear, and leaving only the relationship dynamics there, assuming that there is refinement going on, and there is, we're clearing some of those shadows, and to allow that to unfold.
Beautiful. Yes. So let's talk a little bit more about just daily life, and perhaps in the context of daily life, if when this unfoldment is taking place, perhaps some of the more effective and efficient ways to be with the process while simultaneously being with the flow of experiencing in the context of daily life, and allow for a smooth transition. Yeah.
Yes.
If it's possible.
Well, sometimes for people it's very smooth, and sometimes for people it kind of changes everything.
Mm-hmm.
But people can be in, for example, in a job role, for example, that's completely out of their dharma, but it was necessary for karmic reasons or whatever, and then that gets resolved with the awakening, and all kinds of outside things start changing. But on the other hand, some people can wake up and everything continues as before, essentially, in the outside world, but who they are in relationship to that changes. And then over time, there's a whole series of things just from going out there and living life, just things come up, and you realize, oh, I'm not the same with that anymore, or oh, that story isn't really true. I can let that go.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a whole process of letting go is one of the things. It's amazing, when you become established in the shift too, because there's all this stuff we've been carrying around, the concepts of self, concepts of how we're supposed to be, all these shoulds and musts and have tos and whatever, all this kind of like blah 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 blah, and in emotional kind of grasping and all these kinds of things that we can become conscious of some of that, but certainly beforehand, but it tends to become a lot more conscious afterwards, and because we're taking that bigger step back. And then there's this whole process of like, oh, okay, I don't believe that anymore, or oh, I'm a little entangled here. We can become more conscious of those places where we're contracting, and where we're kind of or there are different kinds of the way we kind of respond habitually and to certain kinds of things. And when we're more conscious of it, then we're starting to be able to make choices.
Mm.
The Bhagavad Gita talks about it in a way where at first we become aware. Oh, I've done it again. We see after the fact, we realize, oh, I've just done that all over again. And then we start to see during. So we're in the middle of, blowing up at our partner or whatever, and we're like, oh, I don't need to do that anymore. And we can let it go in the middle. And sometimes we can stop it then, and sometimes it kind of has to play itself out. But it starts to change. And then at a certain point, we see it just as the impulse arises.
Yeah.
They're just like the impulse to react. And then it's like, then we have a choice to not react, and even to go deeper and go into the seed of that reactivity and find out what the trigger is. Sometimes it's straightforward, and sometimes there's kind of some layers to it. There's a layer and another layer, kind of going back. But then we have the chance to heal that energetically, and then it won't come up again.
Beautiful. Yes, that's I feel it's important to understand the process of surfacing. So surfacing, I feel, is a universal process, and it has two primary directions. One is it's either unconscious, and the surfacing has to do with further identification and condensation of energy, or it is in the midst of evaporation and transcendence. So
and you're talking about those are how we're responding to it?
Yes, basically talking about how the material's arising,
yeah,
and it's either being utilized in egoic dominance for further identification and further condensation of the energy, which has a sort of self-perpetuating nature to it.
Yeah, and that's essentially the wheel of karma.
Yes, the wheel of karma, samsara, yes. Or it's moving in the direction of evaporation and transcendence. And
Yes.
some of the scriptures talk about this in reference to Mahamaya and the energy of Maya, and how there's two different directions of Vidya and avidya, I believe, yes.
Yeah.
And there's some comparisons there, but I haven't really gotten too into it. But if we understand this process and actually have a name for it, surfacing is what it is. And during the awakening process, or during these shifts in our recognition of our reality, surfacing is taking place. Surfacing of material, which is seeking resolution, it's seeking healing.
Exactly.
And it's karmic material.
Yeah.
Sometimes it's gonna come out in expression, like you said. Sometimes you might, something's gonna be said, or there's gonna be this. The body is gonna express behaviorally a certain thing.
Yeah.
But when we are living from that reality, there's a certain level of accountability that's automatic. So no longer is it something that is just like, there's an accountability to the recognition of our divinity. And so there's, the necessary reparations, if there is such a movement in place, are made according to the context. And there's also a very attentive allowing of whatever is being seen in the immediacy in such a way that it's being intelligently resolved. So this is what I consider evaporation. So this energy, it's a primary energy, which I consider an energetic condensation, which we could draw in comparisons from unresolved experiences, traumas, different things.
Yeah.
But also just even more subtly or abstract in that, these energy fields that are associated with egoic dominance. So there are condensated pockets of energy that are associated with collective egoic dominance. And they have a self-perpetuating nature or mechanism. I see them as reflecting in the emotional body, and then reflecting in the mental body, and then we would see that reflecting in the behavioral sphere, or the field of activity.
So just to give a little context to that, so essentially what's happening is you're going through your life, day-to-day life, and then some event happens.
Yes.
So what happens then? Do you react to that event, and is it just this kind of like this drama process that takes place? Or are you seeing like, oh, what's the source of that? And you're seeing how you're responding to it inside, and just reflecting on that. And that can happen long before awakening. But what awakening does is it gives you this space to when you're kind of sitting there observing, that you're able to just kind of see it for what it is much more easily. So it makes the process much easier. But it's still very possible beforehand. So essentially what we're talking about is how we're responding to stuff comes up in our lives. Is it neutral? It's like, oh, that guy's not a very good driver, and it's like, oh well. Or is it like, ah, and we throw a fit over some little thing,
That's right. Yes. I suppose what I feel is important is the understanding that it's something that is in place. It's not something that needs to be avoided. It's something that is a great gift. It's a blessing. It's an opportunity.
And that there's choice in there.
There's choice.
But if it's all unconscious, then there isn't a choice. We're just kind of reacting to life and blah blah blah. And it's that process of ego control just keeps circling it. But as we engage in spiritual practices and so on, we become more conscious and more aware of these dynamics. Then their choice comes up, and then we have that choice as how we respond to the events that happen now.
Yes. And I've seen those that there isn't a full complete shift yet, but there's a recognition of the field value, but it hasn't realized that it is itself yet. But understanding that surfacing is in place now in the context of daily life, when all of these emotions are coming up, when these thoughts are reflecting out of that emotional vibration, and there are certain things being said, or there's different reactivity arising, there's a recognition that this is surfacing, that this field is bringing to the surface within itself that which needs to be healed, and that which, when it is attentively tended to, allows for a greater transcendence and evaporation. So
Right.
no longer is it seen to be a personal process necessarily. It's recognized to be a universal process. And I feel that that's very helpful because it kind of gives us a little space, even if we're not, we don't recognize ourselves as awareness or anything like that. That even in the context of just seeing that this is a process within the experiencing of this domain,
Yeah.
allows for it to be approached in a way that otherwise would be inoperative, because we feel like it's happening to me and it's mine, and that may very well be a part of the surfacing, those sort of clinching down and all,
Yeah.
all of that kind of stuff. But something is able to recognize it, able to reflect and to see what was taking place.
Agreed.
So
And it's
now
so beautiful. It's just a matter of, it's such a key, it doesn't sound like perhaps real practical or but it's such a profound part of learning the difference between shifting that habit of reacting and resisting and controlling, and that, because those habits are not just they're all through those levels, the way we react emotionally, the way we react mentally, and to certain kinds of people, and blah, 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 and all these different things, and just becoming more conscious of those and shifting them. And what happens over time is not only is there much greater clarity, but life itself gets so much simpler. There isn't all this drama and all this stuff going on. It gets clean and simple and much smoother.
Beautiful. Yes.
We're also able to get intuitive signals better and to recognize right action, right choice in the circumstance, where it's just like because there's subtle impulses of, we talked about flows earlier. There's these subtle flows moving through life, and they show up as events, they show up as forms and phenomena, and various kinds of things in our life. And if we're getting a little clearer, they come with intelligence, so that signal is there. And so we can start to pick up that signal, and it's like, we're about to make a decision or go in a certain direction. It's like we get the signal. It's like, oh, over here, look over there, or oh, I should turn here when I'm driving. It's just these kind of signals come through, and it opens our life up to all kinds of opportunities and ease, and things that we would never have personally occurred to us to oh, I need to do this or whatever, or nothing we could have planned or anything like that. It's just like these opportunities that are coming up all the time that we're able to kind of step into. And that's kind of how I got my grad degree. Just it wasn't kind of my plan or anything like that. It's just like there was this signal to do this certain thing that was like, what? And I go in that direction, and it all just kind of like click, 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 and suddenly I'm in grad school.
Beautiful.
Yeah.
Yes, it correlates with this clearing and resolution of karma. And,
Yeah.
and that can take place prior to its behavioral expression. Like, these karmic levels that are coming up, they can come up in a raw, energetic way and can be healed prior to them actually having to be experienced in that way.
Right.
And it's not always going to be like that, but it is very much a possibility. And as this energy is being released and resolved and transmuted, then the natural flow of divine intelligence starts to reveal itself in a way which was being cloaked in all of this, obscuration through our taking ourselves to be, something so limited and finite. And as we're talking about this, it's important to note that none of this is in the realm of personal doership, ownership, or authorship, even if there does still seem to be a sense of a participant, or a sense of us being the participant. That's fine. But as we're moving through these higher stages, this is very much within the realm of the spontaneous flow of divine intelligence.
Right.
And so this body becomes a reflective vehicle for the divine. The functioning of this body reflects the pure divinity that we are.
Right. And that's
clarity.
Yeah, and this is important too, because you can get also in this idea that we have to constantly be checking. It's like, oh, am I reacting? Or, and it's not about, because that's just another way of ego control and trying to manage it or manage the process. What we're talking about is just in your daily living in life, you're going along, and then suddenly there's a reaction, and it's like, okay, so what's there? Or you're kind of sitting reading a book, and you notice there's a real contraction somewhere, and you think,
Yeah.
oh, I can put my attention on that. Just kind of here and there. It's not an all constant thing.
But yes, my experience is if you have to look, then something's off. If you have to look, it'll
You
be
don't go
well
searching.
done.
Things have a
Just
way
like,
of,
just
yeah,
have
things
a
have a
break.
way of kind of ripening. There's kind of, they come up at a time when it's time, and that's when events arise. And so, yeah, trying to go be like, just, you don't want to get into any more control dynamics. Yeah.
Yes, and I feel that from a certain phase of development at least, that would be recognized as well, because that's when there is this sense of you know acting from a limited space of autonomy, that's condensating in its nature. And so
Yeah.
rather than resolution and evaporation and transcendence taking place, there's further condensation, there's further contraction taking place.
Yes.
So when we move into the realm of allowing and receiving, which is not something that we do, but something that more or less that's witnessed, then all of this material now becomes fuel for the fire of enlightenment. No longer is it in this cyclical sort of self-perpetuating process, but it's being utilized by the intelligence, and that apparent density that was present when it is being brought up into the light of our attention in this in a space of recognizing our reality to be infinite, and it's being allowed and healed in that way, now becomes this enlivened, awakened flow of presence and flow of intelligence. And so it's a conversion into bliss, essentially. I consider it. I always talk about that, like, that which appears to be the most awful thing in the experience, is actually just a huge lump of coal that is the best for the fire of bliss. I mean, when it's put in there, it just blazes forth, but it's not exactly always comfortable going through those lumps of coal.
Yeah.
And we have to be willing to go through all of that material, and it's not this kind of constant thing. I find that there's great waves of just pure radiance and bliss, and absolute just nothing coming up. And then there'll be times where it's a little bit more turbulent, and the turbulent times are not worse than the other times, because they're arising in the context of the reality of our own divinity.
Yes.
So I wanted to touch on one more thing about family, or a couple more things. If we're in a situation where our family members are not privy to this type of understanding, they don't necessarily know anything about enlightenment, or awakening, or whatever the case may be. More and more on the planet, we're going to see this unfolding in these types of settings, where perhaps this is taking place for an individual or an apparent individual, and it's those around them do not necessarily know what's going on. So there's a way of being with that is effective and efficient, and that is compassionate. And I feel it's so important to talk about this, at least just a little bit. In my own experience, I've seen that there is a balance being found with the commitment to truth, but that being in total alignment with compassion and love, and not ever, but at the same time, not yielding to residual programs or tendencies surrounding family dynamics, which are kind of being brought forth through guilt or different emotional reflections that are arising. So there is a way to appropriately address an apparent situation that presents itself, and for us to speak with those around us that love us, and for us to tell them that there's a profound transformation taking place, and you know, the one that you love um, isn't necessarily leaving, but is just in the midst of a very beautiful, graced unfoldment. Because I've seen in my own experience that it can be perceived that since we're no longer taking ourselves to be this person, that our family members feel like their family member isn't there anymore. Because it's not in the same way that it was, you know. And it's in the midst of a more dramatic upheaval, it can be difficult for the family, because they feel like perhaps they don't understand, or they don't know what's happening. And I've in a recent case, a couple split up, a married couple, and he said, "I want my wife back. I don't know, my wife's not here anymore, you know, because she's in the midst of this process."
Yeah.
Conscious awareness is realizing itself through that body. And, you know, all of those ideas of herself that perhaps had something to do with that relationship and were a part of the dynamics there are being resolved, you know, being transcended. So it's a sensitive subject, and it's a case by case thing. We couldn't
Yeah.
really
Because
approach it.
some people, as I mentioned earlier, that when they have the shift, not much on the outside changes right away. It's more of a gradual process, one that others can adapt to more easily. And some people have just like a and it just shifts a whole bunch of things, especially if there's a pulling back and detachment, or things that used to be meaningful for them in a relationship are vanish suddenly. But yeah, it varies a lot too, and also it's kind of again about balance in certain kinds of ways. I've always had like when I had my first initial shifts, excuse me, I was single, and it made that process a little simpler in certain ways. Um, but but the but I did maintain an active social life, and so there was a culturing of how to be in the world, because there was a phase at one point where there was the sense of identity, the sense of a David ceased to exist, and I stopped using personal pronouns for about 2 weeks because they didn't mean anything, and it was a bit weird. But you know, a few friends were joking about the person formerly known as David, but then I integrated more, and so it kind of, and that was, you know, there's still this expression here as a person, and it's still very useful to be able to interact with other apparent persons, and to be in the world. And so there's kind of, there can be that need for stepping back and being a bit detached at certain points in the process, but it's not useful to think that that's end the end point. It's just a part of the process, and at a certain point we move past that and reintegrate, and it's healthy. It's healthy to do that. It's healthy to be able to interact with other people. And indeed, you know, we talked about the shadows and stuff earlier. You know, relationships can be really valuable tools, because they can serve as a mirror to our stuff. And it's like, there's consciousness showing me what hasn't been seen yet. Okay.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'll note too on the healing part, we were talking about that if we have a good spiritual practice that takes us deep within, that inherently will provide a lot of healing. Just that deep rest and settledness allows the body to do a lot of good healing automatically. It's more what we're talking about here is more the somewhat larger things. Like we can, for example, go into a nice deep meditation and soften some nice bonds we have with something, and then get up into activity and habitually re-engage them again and reinforce them. And so there could be a kind of a back and forth where it's not quite getting to it. And so these harder nuts, so to speak, can require more direct attention. And that's kind of the way I look at it. So we don't have to go through everything we've ever experienced in every past life, and it has
No.
to be absorbed. And a lot, a lot of that gets, well, actually, yeah, a lot of that is actually roasted by awakening itself. It's one of the more interesting things, even though it's just the first stage. It generally roasts a good deal of our backlog, and clean it. Yeah, it's amazing what it can do.
Mm.
And that first shift is so important.
Yes.
But there's
Yes.
still, there's still all the sprouted seeds that are continuing to unfold in our life, and those are the things we have to deal with. And no matter how enlightened somebody is, if you're here in a human form, in a human body, you came in with stuff, and so there's going to be some value of that unfolding, essentially for the rest of your life. So
Yes.
so coming to terms with it and knowing how to deal with it in healthy and productive ways is really useful.
It is. Yes. And it's a very beautiful point you made about integration, because a lot of what I'm referring to in the family context has to do with these initial phases.
Yeah.
And I look at it or describe shifts unfolding in a 5-phase developmental process, starting with a recognition, which does not necessarily denote a clear shift in identity, but a recognition of one's reality beyond what one is currently taking oneself to be.
Okay.
Transcendence would be a clear shift into this phase that has been recognized, or this reality of yourself as being infinite on some
Like
with some sort
self-realization,
of
cosmic
qualitative
consciousness.
presentation. Yes. Stabilization in that contextual identification. Then there's unification and integration. So a lot can go through the first 3 stages of this process. They get to the stabilization point of the developmental process, but the unification and the integration phases never really unfold fully. And so this is where you'll see a lot of the talk surrounding, sort of a high negation talk. The world isn't, there's no world, there's nothing going on. And there's a lot of emphasis on that and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
No person, and more of an identification as being no person, rather than an identification as being the self, or realizing that you're the self.
Well, and even in that stabilization stage, there's if you haven't cultured the physiology sufficiently with decent practices, there can be that place where there's an opening, and even the shift itself, but then a falling back into the mind because the ground hasn't been prepared enough yet. So there can be a shift, but then it takes a while to kind of go through that process to clear out enough that it can be embodied properly and can go forward.
Yes, yes. And I also want to note that this developmental process is not something that we do, but it's something that unfolds spontaneously in accordance with our willingness and understanding. And that in the context of daily life, family life, if we have the patience, if you will, or if there is the patience, the gift of patience, to just be with the process and to allow things to settle down and not to jump to conclusions when we're in the initial phases, then it can be a lot easier. So when we're talking with family and just sort of communicating to the best of our ability that we're in the midst of an unfoldment, of a transformation, and it's of a spiritual nature, and that it's very important to us, or whatever the languaging is. And then and not necessarily make hasty decisions or reckless decisions from that place,
Right.
of initially moving into this recognition of ourself beyond everything that we had taken ourselves to be previously.
Like the assumption that I'm supposed to become a teacher now. That's a,
That's classic.
that's a really bad. Very few people. Teaching is a skill. Very few people actually have that dharma.
Yes, yes, it is true. And that's an interesting point, because the teaching started unfolding here before the shift. So there was obviously something karmic in place. And the way I feel about teaching is it's not a choice. You don't choose to be a teacher. You can't not be a teacher if that's what your, if that's what your nature is.
Yeah.
And
Whereas here, it's shown up as writing primarily.
yes, exactly. And we're all anyone that's in the midst of this process is a teacher, I consider, on some level, because there's a modeling taking place in this field, and it's modeling something to itself, and it's, there's an enlivening of the presence around those that are in close proximity to us, and all of those different factors.
But the majority of people that I know that are awake are just living their lives like anybody else would. They're not teaching or doing special support or anything like that particularly. They're just living their lives, and
It's beautiful.
Yeah.
Okay, so I felt. I suppose one more point that I'll make in reference to what you were saying about having a healthy spiritual practice, meditation practice, whatever it is that we're called to, is that there are certain modalities that begin to characterize the experiencing, which can become very natural and effortless, surrounding surfacing and healing. For example, one is what I call transmutation, which is essentially just allowing attention to rest on energy as it arises in the body, or it reflects in the emotional body, without necessarily having to sit down and really look at it, but being, the body's still functioning, still at the grocery store, conversation's still unfolding, but this energy is being held attentively and allowed attentively. And this can go on all day long. It can go on for days on end. Sometimes it goes in just a few minutes. Sometimes these big ones require a certain amount of attention.
Yeah, they can be like peeling an onion too sometimes, just layers and
Oh,
layers.
of course,
and layers.
It is that. Yeah, the dimmer switch is getting turned up, and the big ones are at the bottom. So we only get and some of them are piecemeal, and you'll feel like, oh, that one's done, and then something very similar allows for another portion to come up. But in the context of daily living, it doesn't require some sort of withdrawal or an absence from experiencing. As a matter of fact, the experiencing allows for these things to come up,
Right, exactly.
And to be approached in a way which is evolutionary in its nature. And
exactly, yeah. Living enlightenment is living enlightenment, living it in the world, not in a cave somewhere, but out there in the world. Yeah.
Yes, beautiful. So, well, I think that about covers it for today.
Okay.
I want to thank you again for taking the time.
Well, thank you, Andrew.
Just give all glory to pure divinity.
All glory.
Thank you, brother.